It's been a while since I've made one of these videos, but this topic has come up in a few different conversations just over the past couple of days for me, different contexts. And so I thought I would make a short video on transphobia and why I believe that it is a false premise that we should be encouraged to reject. So phobia is an irrational fear of something, a persistent, abnormal, and irrational fear of a specific thing or situation that compels us to avoid that thing or situation, regardless of awareness and reassurance that it's not actually dangerous. It comes from the Greek phobos, fear, terror, outward show of fear, panic. Originally, it meant flight. In this case, transgender advocacy groups are redefining the word transphobia to include fear or hatred of transgender people. Hatred isn't a part of other phobias. And for a lot of people that are being told that they're transphobic, they neither fear nor hate the individual that they're having the conflict with over gender ideology. So I'm going to get into the logical inconsistencies here a little bit more in a moment, but another thing to note is that other phobias like agoraphobia or arachnophobia are identified by the phobic individual. The individual is the one who says, I'm really scared of going outside of my house, or I'm terrified of spiders, or whatever it is that they're afraid of. But in this case, despite the individual saying, no, I don't feel the way you're telling me that I feel, this is a label that's being applied from outside. So this is more of an epithet or a slur or an ideological label that's being applied by someone else to you rather than a true phobia. And that's one of the reasons that I feel really confident in saying that we can reject this framework and not be so intimidated by being called this particular word. It's essentially a made-up definition to get you to ignore your concerns about gender ideology and what it means for a loved one to decide that they're transgender. People who say that they're transgender are just like everyone else, and they're just as deserving of love and respect as everyone else. But their preoccupation with gender ideology can eclipse other aspects of their identity. And often a part of their ideology includes demanding that those around them reflect their gender fixation back to them in a particular way. I want to encourage you to reject this framework. If you are someone who is into this framework, if this is the way that you feel and think, then this probably isn't the video for you, because you will not be interested in rejecting this framework. But I'm trying to speak to the people who are not comfortable with this and are feeling intimidated into going along with something that they're not comfortable with. But going along with the gender framework isn't helpful for your loved one, who is essentially at war with his or her body and reproductive system. Remaining firmly grounded in the truth and focused on other aspects of that individual and your relationship with them is more compassionate, because it doesn't encourage them in their self-rejection. If you do this, however, because of that strong ideological compulsion to get everybody else around them on board with this, reflecting this identity, you're probably going to be called a transphobe, and that might feel very hurtful because it sets up sort of an us and them dichotomy. But I want to go over some of the ways that this term is being used and show some of the confusion and conflict even within gender ideology around what this means, and get into the logical distortions of this. So here's a few ways that transphobia is being identified or defined in the popular culture. So from Healthline. Healthline says transphobia extends beyond a phobia to include hatred, dismissal, and disgust. Basically, it describes any attitude, feeling, or behavior that stigmatizes trans people, denies their identities, treats them as unequal or less than human. A person doesn't have to put these behaviors or beliefs into words for them to count as transphobia either. Maybe they don't consider trans people real men or women, or they tell themselves, I don't have any problem with trans people, but I would never date one. Transphobia can include any discrimination, invalidation, or negative judgment and beliefs related to gender identity. So you can see that that generates a long list of potentially transphobic behaviors. Anything that is a negative judgment related to gender identity. Okay, so that That's a really potentially wide field of landmines. Okay, so there was another website called Therapy Route that published an article entitled "Why the Terms Transgender and Identify As is Transphobic." So it was written that way. That's the grammatical error is with the title. And this was the main idea in one sentence from that article. So I pulled that out for you here. The term transgender is transphobic because it stems from the idea that we were one gender and are transitioning to another gender. The author's main assertion is that people who are trans, were trans, have always been trans, and always will be trans. They're not transgender, they're just trans. And so if you say the word transgender, you're indicating that they moved from one gender to the next, and that's not the case. And so I'm sure that that's probably pretty confusing to you. It's confusing to me as well. And it conflicts with other statements that we see. So I'm pulling these out to show you some of the inconsistencies, even within people trying to identify what this means. Business Insider says, put up an article called 9 Problematic Phrases You May Not Have Realized Are Transphobic. And I'm not going to read those phrases. I'm just going to pull one little excerpt out. It says here, referring to someone as biologically, in quotes, female or male, can be invalidating to a trans person's gender because it implies that they are not, in fact, the gender they identify as. Instead, saying someone was assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth is better. It acknowledges that at birth we are assigned genders decided by our genitalia rather than our actual gender identity. Okay, so this is saying, and this is another one of these really probably pretty confusing ones. The observation of external reproductive characteristics, your genitals, that's what we're supposed to refer to when we talk about a person's original sex, their sex, not their gender identity, but their sex. We're not supposed to say the word biological, according to Business Insider. You want to avoid the word biology here, but it's okay to talk about the reproductive system. So it's very euphemistic. It feels like a lot of linguistic manipulation and gymnastics in order to, avoid things that are going to be triggering and offensive to the person who's hearing it. So I fail to see any significant difference between talking about someone's observable reproductive characteristics and talking about it and using the word biology. But here, this just goes to show how easy it is to trip over these things. So this could be transphobia if you just say it wrong. Business Insider goes on to say that not all trans people experience gender dysphoria. Their experience is equally valid. And like any other mental health issue, dysphoria is a private matter. And so if you zoom in on that mental health issue, we'll talk about that again in a second here. Now, Planned Parenthood says transphobia is now referred to as transmissia. The missia in transmissia means hatred. Binarism is the belief that there are only 2 genders. And so it seems like Planned Parenthood here is acknowledging that the word phobia already has a meaning, and we can't add meaning to an existing word. It's problematic to start adding, trying to expand a definition of something that already exists in our language. So they've created some neologisms in order to get around this problem. So they're trying to promote the use of these words transmissia and binarism instead. And here, finally, the last example I have here is the Advocate refusing to date trans people transphobic. And I'm just going to read 1 or 2 sentences here in this article. Finally, there's the pretext of I only date people I can have children with. The implication being that procreation is more important than any other part of a relationship. This is generally something you will hear from straight people, since lesbian and gay couples will need help with children regardless, and is generally just a cop-out. At the same time, there are transgender people who, I'm not going to keep going. It's too long. So, but it's a cop-out to say that you only date people that you could have children with. And so this is transphobic. to be selective about who you date, or to decide that you won't date transgender people. And these people see this as phobic when you decline to seek reproductive partnerships with people who, by definition, are attacking their own reproductive systems. But if you are a transgender person, a part of this is a prioritizing of cosmetic sexual appearance over reproductive function. And so it's a mismatch of priorities. And so is it any wonder that they would devalue someone else's desire for reproductive pair bonding? Here's one more thing that I pulled this out. Jason Aldean, he's a country music guy, singer, musician. His wife got into some, I guess, social media trouble for a statement that she made saying, "I'd really like to thank my parents for not changing my gender when I went through my tomboy phase. I love this girly life. Advocating for the genital mutilation of children under the disguise of love and calling it gender-affirming care is one of the worst evils. Love is protecting your child until they're mature enough as an adult to make their own life decisions." So she was considered transphobic, and there were some articles written about this transphobia that she was expressing. And I think this is interesting because what she's saying is that an adult can make their own decisions. She's glad that when she was a kid, apparently she had a tomboy phase and wanted to be a boy, and she's happy with being a woman now at this point in her life. So she's glad that she was allowed to continue to develop normally without any intervention. And she's saying that we shouldn't, that it's better for parents to allow their children to grow to maturity and then allow them to make their own decisions. And so it's interesting that that is considered transphobic to me. She did use one word there, the word mutilate, which I think is a pretty strong word that probably drew some offense and raised some eyebrows. But if we go to the definition of the word mutilate, it means to disfigure, maim by depriving of a characteristic part, to cut off a limb or any important part of, to cut off, lop off, to cut short, maim, or mutilate. So this is, and one more definition was properly to deprive of some principal part, especially by cutting off. So by definition, gender-affirming care does involve genital manipulation because oftentimes breasts and penises are being cut off or removed. And so while it's a strong word, it's not definitionally untrue. It's another one of these things where we're kind of trying to soften language, but this is it's correct wording. And genital removal has permanent reproductive consequences, as does hormonal manipulation through medication. So there's a fine line between cosmetic enhancement and self-harm in some of these cases, and particularly when a person is young and hasn't fully had an opportunity to develop into an adult, into their adult form and their adult body and go through all the changes that will happen throughout maturation. They may not be developmentally capable of understanding the consequences of permanent body modification. And this is indeed scary for many people, including parents. But this fear, is this transphobic? Is this a phobia? And that's, I think this is one of the only places where maybe starts to be some potential temptation to apply that definition. Like, are you really afraid of it? And I think I would draw you back to the definition of phobia. It's an irrational fear. An irrational fear, even though you've been reassured and you are aware that it's not dangerous, you're still afraid of it. But in this case, it is scary. It's really scary for a lot of parents to think that their child is going through this stage in their life that may or may not persist. But there are adults potentially in that child's life who could facilitate making these changes permanent before the child has a chance to mature and decide for themselves whether it's something that they really want to do. And these fears are very real for very many parents. It's not a phobia. It's not an irrational fear. So again, I would reject that framework. But coming back to some of the inconsistencies and the points of confusion in this whole linguistic process in this whole this transphobia conversation. Is fear socially permissible? Is hate socially permissible? This term transphobia, the way it's being used, would seem that it's not. These are socially unacceptable perspectives if we're taking it at its face value, even if we accept the word. Fear of transphobia is a kind of fear, right? The people who are afraid of transphobia, that's fear. Is that acceptable? And hate of transphobia or transmissia is a kind of hate, right? Are these okay? And is transgenderism a mental disorder or an identity? If it's a mental disorder, why should we not express concern about it increasing or impacting someone that we care about? I don't like to see a loved one afflicted by depression, but nobody's calling me a depressive phobic or saying that I'm trying to erase depressed people or deny their existence. And if it's an identity, then why can't people dislike it? There's lots of people who hate lawyers or politicians, but they're not considered law phobic or politophobic. And people sometimes might see them as rigid or intolerant in their thinking, but there's not a mass movement to shun and shame them for their thoughts. Some people think it's terrible to send young children to daycare, but they're not seen as, this isn't seen as erasing working moms' existence. And some people think Christians are prudish and deluded, but this isn't called Christianophobia or Christophobia, and it's not considered literal violence. So there's some ways that this is being treated very differently in this particular case. Is gender affirming care necessary mental health support, or is it elective cosmetic medicine? If gender is independent of and not about your body, then why does the body have to be altered to affirm gender? If it's mental health care, then why is the only treatment to lean into the disorder? If transgenderism causes so much anguish that trans people are highly vulnerable to suicide and tremendously sensitive to other people's opinions, then why not focus treatments on encouraging them to find internal strength and resilience? Why accept that this disorder is permanent and reify it, unlike other disorders where we try to resolve or alleviate symptoms? If this is elective cosmetic medicine, then why build mental health campaigns around it? And why encourage very young people to access it? We don't do this with rhinoplasty or breast augmentation or other forms of body modification. And those surgeries also, other elective cosmetic surgeries, are not funded by insurance, unlike transgender care. Whether we like it or not, we're going through a time when many people, particularly a lot of young people, are caught up in an obsession about gender. And this means that increasingly you're going to encounter people who believe in a gender identity or consider themselves to be transgender. I believe that it's important to remember the humanity and the dignity of the person in front of you, and to value the connection that you have with that individual, if it's someone that's in your life and that you care about, but not to allow yourself to adopt or accept an irrational framework for communication. The concept of transphobia is a very new one. Indeed, the very word is new. The first usage was somewhere around 1992, and you can see that it just skyrocketed after the 2010s. So it's a brand new concept. So for a lot of us, this is still something we're learning about and coming to realize as a part of our world now. You can respect another person's right to their beliefs without being compelled to participate in them. Gender ideology adherents place identity before personhood, and I would just encourage you not to make the same mistake. Be honest in your speech, and if someone reacts emotionally to the way that you speak and express yourself, that is their choice. It's not your responsibility. Reject the notion of transphobia and put the person first, not the identity. Thanks for listening. I hope this is helpful in getting your own thoughts going around this idea and what this is meaning in your life and how you're seeing it show up. There's certainly a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of points of confusion. And I think we're all just kind of working through this and learning about it. It's important to just remember the humanity in each and every one of us and share this if it's helpful to you. Thank you.